It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for rejoining what I promise will be an enriching conversation, and one that is so pertinent right now. In a world where technology and digital media has been seemingly integrated into every aspect of our lives, maybe a little too much so, we can't ignore the impact it has on our perceptions of ourselves, our interactions with others, and I think our overall well-being. But how exactly does it affect our ego, how we see ourselves? Here to help us dive into this topic, we are joined by one of our favorites, Councillor Danielle Meyer. Danielle, thank you so much. Is this one of those that you're terrified to broach or excited to broach?
I'm actually really excited to talk about this. You know, it's something that's been coming up recently and definitely a topic that we need to talk about.
Because it kind of affects all of us.
Yeah.
Our ego often is what takes us to the greatest heights, because that self-belief is absolutely vital, and then allows us to fall the greatest heights, because it can be such a major stumbling block in our lives in a social context. Let's establish what the ego is, first of all. How would you describe it?
So the ego, when we speak about the ego, right, it refers to our sense of self, so sort of the I, right? Your psyche, your character, your sense of self. And so it's always good, depending on the state of your ego, to see how that's actually affecting the way you think, the way you feel, the way you behave. And so that's always important.
How does this then affect the way that we behave? So, for instance, if I have a very healthy ego, I say with some license there, and am very confident and back myself, as opposed to someone whose ego is diminished by that same standard, how does that affect our behavior?
Yeah. So with the healthy ego, right, I mean, it can definitely encourage you to achieve those goals, right, to be confident in your ability.
Yeah.
It's confidence, exactly.
Faith in yourself, yeah.
But when we venture into that area of an unhealthy ego, that's where we start to dive into some unhealthy behaviors, becoming maybe critical, judgmental, domineering, not really taking responsibility, right? Sort of establishing a false sense of self. So we need to be careful with that.
As I hear you speaking, I feel my blood chilling, thinking about the effect of social media in this space. And I've gotten over my baggage with social media in terms of it just being painted with one brush, because there are some amazing content creators out there doing amazing things for mental health, physical health, the ego, and that the system itself, not so much. Certainly some platforms like Instagram, which are very much a window into life, not necessarily reality. What impact is social media in your space having on the ego?
Yeah, so when we talk about the ego and social media, right, I think social media can create that need for external validation. And so we're having people resort to the likes, the comments, the subscribers. And so that can sort of sometimes also create that false sense of confidence and, you know, ultimately lead to a lack of self-awareness. And that contributes to us having an unhealthy ego. So we have to be careful how we actually navigate the digital space when it comes to that.
How do we keep ourselves in check then? Because a lot of the algorithms, and I've done it before, and I've seen a lot of my friends do it, unnecessarily. You think it's necessary, okay, well, I better start with pick with the top off first, because I know that's going to get to 300 likes, and then I can put the watch in the second thing, and you're selling a watch. Oh, what are you selling? But we all do it, because that's what the platform is kind of designed and primed for. How do we then keep ourselves in check? When do we know ourselves, before our significant other puts their hand up and says, listen, keep your ego in check, when do we know we are starting to push on the too confident side?
Yeah, so definitely, you know, when it comes to the digital space, we have to be so careful with what we're actually engaging with online. So, you know, practicing that digital mindfulness in that space. Yeah, it's a choice. And how do we maintain a healthy ego within the digital space? I mean, it's looking at those algorithms, looking at, you know, are there feeds, posts, or, you know, unsubscribe, unfollow, unblock that social media
block it. If you don't like it, block it,
Yeah, and definitely from time to time, maybe engage in a social media detox, reconnect again, and that helps us maintain that healthy ego when we reconnect with the self in the real world. So finding that balance.
I like the fact that you said in the real world, because so much of what we're talking about speaks of this imaginary space, this cloud or whatever you will, that doesn't actually exist. It has a representation, and then on the flip side, you've got this necessary self-belief that we need, and both can get knocked so heavily. How then do you keep that center? What's a good exercise to go through? And we can expand on it in the next segment, but what's a good place to start when wanting to build that healthy ego?
So when it comes to a healthy ego, definitely work on that self-awareness. You know, as I was saying earlier, sometimes we get so lost in this digital space that it creates that false sense of confidence in essence.
That's not actually you.
It's not actually you. And so what's being validated is not really your authentic self. So we need to focus on doing the inner work.
And we're going to continue to do the inner work today. Danielle's not going anywhere. We are talking about ego in the digital space. Has social media changed the game? Maybe you feel differently now that you're playing in that space. 063-408-8863. When does confidence become arrogance? How do you feel about ego?
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back as we dive back into our exploration of the ego and how it could be changing and how we need to navigate through this space in the digital landscape that we find ourselves in. And registered counsellor Danielle Meyer here to provide insight into a few relatable scenarios as well as advice on what to do should we find ourselves in similar situations. And you might really connect to these. So Danielle, if you don't mind, I'm going to throw a couple of scenarios at you and get your take. And you can chuckle if you want at these scenarios,
Yes.
but the thing is they're real, okay? So first up, you and your partner, you love posting about your date nights on social media. You share a post on Instagram of the two of you. The comments only complimenting her roll in. Your self-esteem hasn't been great lately and you feel hurt and angry. You don't express those feelings and it becomes an argument. I want to say who's at fault here, but I think everyone's a little bit at fault here. No, I mean, this kind of scenario, as silly as it sounds, plays out every minute, probably.
Exactly. You know, we think it's bizarre, but actually because we've been playing into, you know, looking at how the digital space influences the ego, it's become so fragile. And so in that moment, something like that could cause an argument.
How do you deal with it?
Yeah. So, you know what? I would say in that moment, definitely take a minute to self-reflect and say, okay, is it me, right?
My girl is hot.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely take a moment to reflect and say, okay, you know what, perhaps it's me in this situation. Let me reassess where I'm at. Again, looking at the fragility of that ego and how that's been playing into the situation.
It's not like anyone's attacking you, and it's
No.
just purely your perception of self that is
Yes,
influencing that
yes,
feeling and
yes.
damaging the ego in that space.
Yeah, yeah.
I get that, and compliment your girl if you're going to do that. Just make it a good thing, make it a positive thing. Okay,
Yeah.
so now scenario 2, and you guys can play along at home. You are in a work meeting, and a colleague of yours says they never received an important document you were meant to email them. You are adamant that you sent it. Your boss tells you, your colleague, to check his inbox more carefully. After the meeting, you check your outbox and see that it never sent because the file size was too big. Do you apologize and admit your mistake, show that you have a weakness, that you screwed up in a pivotal moment? Or do you you know,
Yeah.
take ownership and increase your collateral because you're that kind of person?
So
How do you
look,
deal with it?
sometimes naturally you're going to be like, well, I don't want to admit that I made the mistake. But in that moment, it's so important to realize, look, I made a mistake. Let me admit that, right? Rather than
ownership.
take ownership of it. And that's what it's really about, taking accountability and taking ownership. And that's really how we maintain that healthy ego.
Because I think, and there's something about taking responsibility
Yeah.
that speaks to being present in the moment, in reality.
Exactly.
In here and now, not
Yeah.
in that entire, you know, the slightly different digital
Yes,
space, which is a
yes.
version of reality
Yes.
in that. But I get that. Take ownership of your mistake. They'll respect you for it.
Yeah.
Let's get in one more scenario here. You introduce two of your friends to each other and they hit it off. Shortly after, you see on social media that they're hanging out together without you. Oh, you feel hurt, excluded, and angry. You want to cut both of them out of your friend group immediately. This must happen very often. We're
Yeah.
social people like that.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that kind of disconnect?
Yeah, we see that happen so often. And again, it's what is the value that we're placing on others and ourselves, right? And so in that moment, you know, to expect that person to solely just
They don't
connect with-
belong to you.
Yeah, exactly. So again, it's recognizing boundaries, it's recognizing healthy relationships in the real world and the digital space, and actually seeing how we can navigate that and form those healthy relationships, healthy sense of self.
And that speaks to both sides as
Yeah,
well. So you're
yeah.
absolutely on the money there. So before we go scrolling,
Yes.
and I love doing it. I love it. I love to see what people are doing, and I love to
Me
get
too sometimes.
inspirational memes and things. I get a lot of positive out of it. Before I
Yes.
start judging myself too harshly,
Yeah.
what advice do you have for someone who's wanting to take the first step towards building a healthy ego? What does that process start with?
Definitely practice mindfulness. Cultivate a sense of self-awareness. start taking responsibility, start taking accountability, looking at the boundaries that you're setting, not just with yourself, but with others as well.
Within relationships.
Within relationships, within the digital space, within your own life as well. And that's really how we're going to maintain a healthy ego. That should be your starting point in actual fact. Starting with the self and sort of recognizing where you're at the moment and what you can work on. How can I be self-aware?
And that doesn't mean self-judgment. We're not about that. When we hold up a mirror, it's so that we can understand ourselves.
Yes.
Leave the baggage at the door when it comes to yourself. There's enough of that going around. Just focus on the positives within yourself that make you feel good, that lead to positive engagement with other people.
Exactly.
That's your roadmap. You can see when you're at your best. You know when you're at your worst. So feed that positive energy. Danielle, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've delayed my scrolling for at least 30 minutes at that today, but just be kind to yourself today and back yourself. You know, a little bit of ego is a good thing, I think.